Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today we're telling Vi by Nikolai Gogol, published in the year 1835. A story from the Ukrainian steppe about three students on the road, about a night at a lonely farmstead, and about a young man who must keep watch for 3 nights alone in a church. Make yourself comfortable, breathe calmly, and let yourself be carried to Kiev on a summer morning on which the holidays begin. As soon as the morning bell had rung at the Kiev seminary and the holidays began, the whole body of pupils poured out through the gates in a single noisy stream. The smallest first, then the bigger ones, last of all the students of the upper classes, and the streets of the city filled with song, bellowing, and the smell of dust and tobacco. For the seminary's charges were now going home, each to his village, and since the fewest of them had money for the road, they went on foot, in groups, and lived along the way on what they could earn by singing. They knocked at farmsteads, drew themselves up in rank and file, sang a pious hymn, and for it received bread, bacon, millet, or even a jug of spirits, and moved on. So 3 students too set out on the way, who had known one another for years. The one was the theologian Kalyava, a long, heavy fellow with a voice like a church bell and the fixed habit of pocketing everything that was not nailed down. If a spoon vanished in a house, one knew where it had gone. The second was the rhetorician Tiberius Gorobets, the youngest of them, still beardless, but already with a pipe in his mouth and the ambition to be second to the elder ones in nothing. And the third was the philosopher Khoma Brut, a broad-shouldered, powerful fellow with dark hair, a man of unshakable composure. He liked to smoke, he liked to drink, and if something unpleasant befell him, he lay down to sleep, and when he woke, it was usually not so bad anymore. The 3 walked the whole day, sang at 2 or 3 farms, ate what was given them, and came toward evening into a region in which the farmsteads grew ever rarer. The sun sank, the steppe turned gray, then black, and at last the night stood without a moon over the land. They lost the way. They tramped through grass that came up to their chests. They stumbled into hollows. They argued about which way to turn, and at some point they fell silent and simply went on, for they had long since had no destination. Then a dog barked, and shortly after, the dark outlines of a small farmstead rose before them out of the night. They knocked, and after a long wait, an old woman opened. She was small and bent, with a face like crumpled leather, and she held a candle so that she could examine the 3 without getting much light on herself. "What did they want?" she asked. "A night's lodging," said the students. They had lost their way and could go no farther. The old woman grumbled that there was no room. She had nothing. She wanted quiet. The 3 begged and flattered, and Khoma Brut said they were pious folk and would sing for her in the morning for it. And at last she gave in, with one condition: they were not to lie together. The theologian should go into the shed, the rhetorician into the storeroom, and the philosopher into the empty sheep pen. That was strange, but they were tired, and a roof was a roof. So Khoma lay down in the straw in the sheep pen, shoved his bread bag under his head, and fell asleep almost at once. He woke because someone was in the pen. The door stood open, and in the dark the old woman came toward him, with outspread arms, bent, soundless. Khoma half raised himself and wanted to say something, half in jest. He was no fearful man, but the words stuck in his throat. For her eyes gleamed in a way in which human eyes do not gleam. He tried to stand up and could not. He wanted to cry out, and no voice came. The old woman was upon him, sprang onto his back, struck him in the side with a broom, and Khoma felt himself driven forward like a horse that gets the spurs. He ran. He ran out the door, across the yard, out into the steppe, and then happened what he could never afterward explain. The ground stayed behind. They were flying. Beneath him lay the plain, wide and moonlit. Although the moon had not been there, the grass stood still, and in the grass he saw things he did not want to see. Sheets of water in which something stirred, a face that looked up out of a pool and laughed at him, a water woman who turned in the reeds. The air was mild and smelled sweet, and in him something worked that was not only horror. He felt an exhaustion that was almost pleasant, and at the same time a wild anger. And in this anger Khoma Brut began, while he carried and was carried, to speak with his last strength the prayers he had learned at the seminary. All the exorcisms against evil spirits that he knew, one after another, loud, hasty, without stop or pause. And the ride grew slower. They sank back to earth, and all at once the spell was broken. Khoma stood again in the grass, and the old woman was off his back and stood before him. Now he was the stronger. He tore a log from the ground. Later, he could not say where it came from, and struck, blind with rage and fear, again and again. And the old woman howled and fell and howled once more, duller now, and at last she lay still. Khoma stood panting over her, the log in his hand, and looked down. And what lay in the grass was not the old woman. There lay a young woman, scarcely older than himself, with long braids, with fine, clear features, and her lashes lay on her cheeks like arrows. She was of a beauty such as Khoma had never seen, and she was bloody, and she scarcely breathed any more. Then a horror seized him that was worse than everything before. He dropped the wood and ran. He ran without looking back until morning came, and he came to a road and to a village and wandered on. And 3 days later, he was in Kiev, dusty, hungry, with torn clothes, and in a condition that he treated in the only way he knew. He went to the tavern, drank, gambled, drank still more, and spoke to no one about it. After a few days, the matter was finished for him, as everything was finished for him once he had slept on it long enough. Then the rector had him summoned. In the office stood a stranger in rich Cossack dress, and the rector said this man came on behalf of a sotnik, one of the richest Cossacks of the region, whose farmstead lay far to the south. The sotnik's daughter lay dying. She had been struck in an inexplicable way. She had been found half dead in the steppe, and she had uttered a last wish to which the father clung as to a command. After her death, for 3 nights, the philosopher Khoma Brut of the Kiev seminary was to read the prayers for the dead at her coffin. He, and no other. Khoma stood there and felt the ground go soft beneath him. He said he knew no sotnik's daughter. It must be a mistake, and he could not possibly get away. The rector replied that it was no mistake. The wish named his name. Khoma declared that he refused. Then the rector grew plain. It concerned one of the most powerful men of the region. The seminary could not afford this quarrel, and if the philosopher would not go willingly, they would let him go. In the way the seminary kept ready for the recalcitrant, with rods. The next morning, Khoma Brut sat on a wagon between 6 armed Cossacks and drove south. The journey lasted days. Khoma tried along the way to question the Cossacks, and what he heard did not make the matter better. They spoke of the young lady with a mixture of reverence and unease. A beauty she had been, they said, But there had been things one did not talk about. A puppy had died shortly after an encounter with her. A maid had fallen ill. A stable boy had vanished. Old Yavtuk, the eldest among them, said only that she would surely know why she had sent for the philosopher. Khoma tried to flee twice, the first time in the night, the second time during a rest. Both times the Cossacks had an eye on him, and the second time they laughed at him and did not even tie him up. When they arrived, the young lady was already dead. The farmstead was large and rich, with stables and granaries and a crowd of people, and everything was full of muffled busyness. The sotnik received Khoma in a dark room, a tall, stooped man with a gray mustache whose face grief had hollowed out. He asked him how he had known his child. Khoma swore he had never seen her. The sotnik looked at him a long while and then said that his daughter, dying, had named him, his full name, and that she had been of clear mind. If he read the 3 nights, he would get 1,000 ducats. If not, here the old man made a pause, then he should know that his word held on this farm and that he, the sotnik, was accustomed to carry out his daughter's last will. Then they led Khoma into the room where the dead woman lay. She was not yet in the church. She lay laid out under candles, in red velvet, her face uncovered. Khoma stepped nearer, looked, and the ground swayed under him a second time. It was the young woman from the steppe. The same features, the same lashes, the same braids. She lay there as though she slept, and her face was so beautiful and so innocent that Khoma, with the horror sitting on his neck, at the same time felt something else that frightened him still more. A kind of tenderness. In the evening they carried the dead woman out. The estate's old wooden church stood apart behind the vegetable garden, half decayed, unused for years, the roof sagging, the windows blind. They set the coffin before the altar, lit the candles, brought Khoma the lectern and the books, left him bread and a jug of spirits, and went out. Then the heavy door fell shut, and the bolt was pushed across from outside. Khoma stood a moment and listened to the steps moving away across the yard. Then he looked around. The church was larger than it seemed from outside and almost empty. From the walls, the images of saints looked down, browned by the smoke of decades. In the corners lay darkness that the candles did not reach, and over everything hung the smell of old wood and cold incense. Khoma did what a sensible man in his situation does. He took a hearty pull from the jug, drew a few more candles up to his lectern, opened the book, and began to read, loud and fast, to hear his own voice. For a while it went well. Then he noticed that as often as he raised his gaze, he inevitably looked at the coffin, and that as often as he looked at the coffin, he lost the thread. He forced himself not to look. He read louder, and then he heard a sound that made his hair stand on end, a creaking as when wood moves. He raised his head. The dead woman had sat up. She sat in the coffin, upright, with closed eyes, and then she stood up and climbed out, and her movements were not those of a human being, but those of a puppet that is worked. She walked with outstretched arms through the church, groping, searching, and Khoma understood with a clarity that almost made him calm. She does not see me. Without knowing why, in the moment she rose, he had drawn a circle with his heel in the dust around his lectern and spoken the prayers he knew from his ride. And the dead woman came up to this circle and no farther. She stood close before him, blind, with blue lips. She stretched out her hands, and the hands struck against something that was not there, and she went around him again and again, and her fingertips ran along the invisible wall as along a pane of glass. Khoma stood upright in his circle, the book before his chest, and read on with a rattling voice, without pause, without breath, until the cocks crowed. At the first crow she fell where she stood, and then lay again in the coffin, orderly as she had been laid in. In the morning the Cossacks came, opened the door, and found a philosopher who was gray in the face and whose hair had turned white on one side. They asked how the night had been. Khoma said, "Good," and asked for spirits. And old Yavtuk looked at him and said, "2 nights more." All day, Khoma tried everything. He begged the Sotnik to let him go. The old man said only, "2 nights more," and turned away. He tried to escape into the steppe. The Cossacks caught up with him before he had the garden behind him and brought him back, laughing, for they had orders. So he did the only thing left to him. He drank. He drank so much that in the evening 2 of them had to lead him to the church, and he sang as he went, and the Cossacks were uneasy at this singing. The second night was worse. Khoma drew his circle before he even opened the book, and this time he did not wait for the creaking. He read from the first minute as loud as he could, and the dead woman rose earlier than the night before. She climbed out of the coffin, went blindly toward him, struck the invisible boundary, and then she began to speak. She spoke words that were no language, but that called something, and at her calling the church filled. It came from the walls, from the windows, out of the dark corners. Something struck against the shutters, something scratched at the doors, wings beat in the rafters, voices whispered in one corner and laughed in another. And before Khoma's eyes, shapes flitted through the candlelight that he must not look at if he wanted to go on reading. He stared at the page of the book until the letters danced, and read, and read, and above him, around him, close before his circle, the whole night raged. Twice he thought he felt a hand on his shoulder and did not dare to make sure. Once the dead woman struck with both fists against the air, and Khoma saw how the dust lifted at the edge of the circle as though something pressed against it. At the crow of the cock, it was over, as sudden as a slammed window. When they fetched him in the morning, he could barely walk. His hair was now wholly white, and he spoke disjointedly. He went to the Sotnik, threw himself down before him, and implored him to spare him. He told him everything, the steppe, the old woman, the log, everything. The Sotnik heard him out. Then, he said, it changed nothing. His daughter had willed it so, and if she had had him summoned, then it was God's affair or another's, but it would happen. And Khoma Brut, who in his life had gotten out of every situation by lying down to sleep, understood that this time there was no way out. He danced that afternoon in the yard, alone, wild, like one possessed, until he fell down and the maids crossed themselves, and in the evening they led him to the church for the 3rd time. The 3rd night began as the 2nd had ended. Khoma drew his circle as deep as he could, spoke his exorcisms, and read with a voice that was already half failing. And the church fell upon him. The dead woman rose, called her words, and this time everything answered at once. It howled over the roof. It threw itself against the walls so that the old wood groaned. The windows burst, and in came what had waited outside. The church filled with shapes such as no man can describe, and no one more than another. They hung on the images. They ran over the beams. They stood pressed close around the circle, and all sought him, and none found him. For all were blind to the one who stood in the circle. Khoma read. He held the book with both hands and saw not a line any more, and read on, from memory, with closed eyes, while around him it raged. And then it grew still. Into this stillness a voice said, quite calmly, "Bring the V." And Khoma heard something approaching that was heavy. They brought it in. They had to support it, for it walked with difficulty, a squat, clumsy being of earth and iron, wholly coated with earth, and its eyelids hung down to the ground. The V stopped before the circle and said, "Lift my eyelids. I see nothing." And the shapes came and reached for the lids to lift them for it. Khoma stood in his circle, and in him a last clear voice said, "Do not look. Whatever happens, do not look." He stood with lowered head, and everything in him knew it, and everything in him held fast. And then, in the last moment, without willing it, Khoma Brut raised his eyes, and the V lifted its iron finger and pointed at him and said, "There he is." Then everything threw itself upon him, for now they saw him. Khoma fell, and with him something in him fell, and he was dead before he reached the floor. But in that moment the cock crowed outside the first time, and it was already the second crow, for the first the spirits had failed to hear. They rushed to the windows and to the door to escape, and could no longer get out. They stuck fast in the windows, in the doors, in the cracks of the old wood, and there they have remained. The church was never opened again afterward. The way to it grew over with thorns and brush. The roof sank in. The beams rotted, and today no one knows exactly any more where it stands. Khoma's friends in Kiev learned of it later, in the tavern, over a jug of beer. The theologian Kaliava said the philosopher had been a good man and drank. The rhetorician Gorobets said he had perished because he had been afraid. Had he not been afraid, the witch could have done nothing to him. One must simply not be afraid, he said, and then he ordered another jug and talked of other things. That was our short retelling of V by Nikolai Gogol. A young man stands for 3 nights in a circle that nothing can penetrate, and what finally gives him up in the end is not the power of the spirits, but a single look that he could not refrain from. Sometimes the most dangerous thing is not what seeks us, but our longing to look it in the face. Good night, and if you like, we'll hear each other again tomorrow at Sleepy Classic Tales.